So thank you to all of you guys for coming to join this session. My name is Kirsten. I'm a biologist by background and I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry for quite some years now. I'm a consultant for qordata, as Emily just mentioned. So this session will focus on solutions and bright ideas for analyzing compliance data to ensure global compliance. And as it says in the program, the session is thought to foster discussions on best practice sharing and lessons learned. I think we had some fantastic discussions already this morning. Some of those points I think we might raise again here in this session, so we'll see how that goes. As a brief agenda, I will start with some potential benefits of data analytics in the compliance context, and then give some examples on using analytics for internal monitoring as well as external monitoring. I will then continue with a brief summary of business and compliance considerations, and then I think we should lead over to a nice discussion on practice sharing and lessons learned. So I will take about 25 minutes to go through my slides, so that should leave plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to raise them in between. I will use examples from both the US and the EFPIA data that's been published to do these analytics that we're doing. So I'll point out which one it's coming from when we go through the slides. So first of all, I think we all know that analytics is quite a hot topic, and some of those questions were raised this morning already. I think this was quite interesting. This is from a session from a US conference a couple of months ago, and it was a panel discussion. The panel consisted of people from the Department of Justice and from the industry, so regulators, and they were asked to give their opinion on what the data that's available, publicly available, is actually currently being used for. And I think there were 2 points that stood out the most to me. First of all, one of the Attorney Generals said that for every dollar that is spent on analytics, they recover $6 in fines. And we heard some examples of those yesterday, actually. And we don't know who's paying those fines. On the other side, in the industry, the people that are working in the compliance department, they were asked what keeps them up at night. And what they mostly answered is that they had the data, so why did they not know? So this is what was worrying them. So obviously, knowing the data is very important. And I think making the point here that analytics is one of the best ways to know the data that you're having and be able to answer any questions that might come from different either regulators, from the public, from the press, whoever. So what we found when we're working with different pharmaceutical companies is that analytics of compliance data may help in all these points that I've listed here. And I've mentioned already, knowing the data is one of the main points. So in terms of internal monitoring, obviously monitoring the spend by doing analytics is also a point that has been raised many times when we're discussing this with the pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, it helps to deliver executive briefings, and that's one of the examples that I will bring later to show you a dashboard and how this can be done. And another point that was raised yesterday and also this morning, internal analysis and internal monitoring is a good way of identifying outliers, and especially in comparison and in combination with the detection fraud models. I think it's a very good way of using the data that you have internally and making sure that you're minimizing the risk that you might have by engaging with physicians and healthcare organizations. So in terms of external monitoring, we've heard the word benchmarking and competitive analysis this morning already, maybe with some controversy. So I think that's an interesting point to discuss in a bit more detail later. Obviously this data is useful for benchmarking. And I think it depends very much on how you look at this from a company point of view and how you want to use it and what it might be useful for. So with that, I want to go to a couple of examples, starting first with the internal monitoring. So this is an example of an executive dashboard helping to give executive overviews. You can see this is taken from the US, so we have a couple of years of data. So you can compare your spend from one year to the next, and you can compare the spend by specialty, and also obviously what different physicians have been receiving and what the teaching hospitals in this case have been receiving. And also in the lower right hand side you can see what exactly the money has actually been spent on in terms of the different categories that are shown, also from one year to the next. So obviously a good dashboard will allow you to answer questions as they come up. So in this case, for example, if a question comes up and what exactly was a breakdown for a certain specialty, which often goes together with the different business units that are part of the company, a good dashboard would allow you to then just click on the specialty and get the breakdown just for this specialty rather than just a summary. So in this way, it's a good overview on what is actually happening internally in the company. I think we touched on the topic before that this might be a very good way to optimize processes as well and to see what are we doing internally and is there anything we need to improve. So another example for internal monitoring that we touched on yesterday as well is the use for identifying outliers. So this is an example again taken from the US for meal expenses and a screenshot, and the company had put the limit for $150, and you can see quite clearly, well I hope you can see it, this is the cutoff point, that there are some payments that were above the $150 limit. So a good analytics tool would allow you to just click on the dots and identify each one of those and try and understand why these payments were higher than what was actually originally thought that should be the limit. So that way you can explain it, depending on the timing of the analysis that you do it will also help you to actually prevent any sort of questions to arise. And I think we had a really good example this morning as well from Boehringer, saying that knowing your data and being prepared to answer questions that might arise with that data is essential. So then I would like to move on to the topic of external monitoring. And the topic that we also discussed again this morning, the topic of consent rate, which has been receiving a lot of interest. And I've just taken some numbers from the press here. One of those you have seen before. There's an example from Germany, where the Spiegel reported that about 28% of the physicians had consented to the disclosure. In the UK, it was about 70%, so quite a bit higher. And I think it obviously leads on to the discussion of, what are these numbers useful for? Have we reached our aim by doing this sort of transparency initiative? You've seen this example before this morning as well, much discussed. So the Spiegel spent a lot of time, building this database, taking the data that's publicly available, and allowing everybody to have a look at those 20,000 physicians that actually disclosed. And I think it's a good example of that we've seen that we've heard before. Know your data. Make sure you can answer questions because it is publicly available, so someone can take it and can analyze it, whether it's the press or whether it's other regulators. So these were the consent rates that were estimated before the disclosure was actually done. And you can see that the estimated consent rate for Germany was 35% and for the UK was 68%, so it was actually quite close to what was found in the press. And you can see there's a wide range of consent rates, and I won't go into the details of how these consent rates can be calculated and why there might be differences. We heard this morning that there's different platforms to collect them, there's different laws in place, and there's a lot of movement in this field as well, which is important to take into account and also to keep in mind when looking at these consent rates. Nevertheless, it might be interesting to look at the actual consent rates, and because it's publicly available, it is quite easy to compare the consent rates between the countries if you go through the effort to take all the data that is available. So this is an example for external monitoring using the consent rates across EFPIA countries, and we have 4 countries just for the ease to look at it here. So we have Germany, Italy, Spain, and then the UK. And obviously you can look at the consent rates different types, so by number or by amount spent. And then we can look at the different categories, so the services or consultancy, the travel and accommodation, and you can see if there's any variation in the consent given. What I think personally is more useful to compare is looking at an individual country, so taking Germany as an example again, and we did touch on that this morning as well, that there was a wide variation of the consent given within Germany in the different countries. Companies. So we blacked out the names of the companies here, but you can see that it varied basically from 0 to 100% of consent. And obviously this sparks discussions on why this is the case. Is there anything we need to do in our internal communication from the pharmaceutical companies to the physicians? Is there anything that the bodies need to do in order to facilitate this process? And I think these are good and valuable discussions to move the whole field forward. Moving away from the topic of consent rates, obviously there might be other things that are interesting to look at. So what we find when we speak to companies is that one thing that's very interesting is to actually compare the spend of one company to another in terms of the different categories. And it helps to actually think about, how are we using the money that we're using? Are we in line with what the other companies in that industry are spending? Or is there anything that we are doing different, and is that good or bad? So again, it helps to spark internal discussions on the processes within the company. So in this case here, we have two companies, and we can see the type of spend in the different categories, and you can see differences between the spending patterns. Also, you can see large differences in this case in the number of physicians that have been engaged, and also the amounts that the different companies have been spending on those physicians. Another topic that we've found that has raised quite a bit of interest is obviously if different companies have engaged the same physician, who was that? So an example here of a physician in the UK, and he has been engaged by 3 different companies that have spent different amounts. So it might be interesting there as well to think about, is the spending of your company in line with the spending of the other companies, or why it might be different, if there's a good reason for it. So those were the examples that I wanted to give. So before we go into a discussion, some business and compliance considerations of these analytics. So I think for compliance, it's very important that you know where you stand in the context of the industry. So this is what we mean in terms of benchmarking your spend. And then in the topic of consent rates, obviously think about, do you have to do something to increase your consent rate, if it is particularly low. In terms of business considerations, I think it is very interesting to look at these spendings and compare it by specialty, physicians, healthcare organizations in the different categories and so on. So there's a lot of different analysis you can do, apart from the ones that I've shown as examples. Once you've collected the data, it's just a matter of asking the right questions and knowing what you want to look for. So here I've just listed understanding your spend end-to-end, monitoring your spend end-to-end, and I think that's something which we haven't discussed yet so far in this conference here, is when would be a good point to actually do the analysis that people are doing. Is it good to do it at the end of the year, just before you publish? Is it good to do it throughout the year to make sure that your spending doesn't reach a certain amount or limit, depending on what we set? So I think all of this analytics can be very useful for. And obviously, effectively comparing your spend against the industry. So some points that I've noted for discussions, and like I said in the beginning, so some of those I think we have touched upon already this morning. So now in a smaller group, I think it would still be interesting to maybe take up those points again. So benchmarking and compliance in business. Currently, do you actually have the tools to answer the questions that are being asked in the business, or maybe from other stakeholders? Do you feel confident in knowing your data? And what will also be very interesting to maybe exchange here in this room What part of the data has been receiving the most interest in your company? Is it the spend categories? Has it just been the consent rates, or is there other questions that are coming from the business or from the compliance departments? In terms of consent rates, we've just discussed this a bit already now. So, is it actually representing the effectiveness of communication, or is there a lot of other cultural factors that are coming into play that influence these sorts of consent rates? And then a more general question, do the different regulatory requirements represent a challenge if you're working for multinational companies and you're trying to have uniform processes across the EFPIA region? So these are some points that I thought would be quite interesting to raise for discussion. And obviously I'm happy to discuss any others if there's questions that have arisen throughout the talk. Are there any questions? Yeah?
I was just going to add that as part of internal analytics, it's very useful for commercial operations to see where their reps are spending their time and money.
Yeah, yeah. So are there any examples from companies in the room that are already using this?
We use data analytics a lot internally, mostly for monitoring. So of course from there we can have some other breakdowns that we can share with commercial business just to see if it makes sense, but primarily we use for monitoring purposes.
And are the questions coming from the business side, or are you offering the information?
Yeah, no, we are not offering information. So if they need to ask about any specific thing, we answer to them. But mostly they have all the data as well by themselves internally. So they have huge databases for all the reasons. It's just to match if they are aligned or not. Usually the questions come from that.
You asked the question, or you mentioned the concept of when you should be monitoring or when you should be looking at the data. And a lot of, what you find out when you aggregate data should point to a trend. So if in this year you point to something, you need to look at it prior to, because it's going to, if it reveals everything is good, then that's great. But if it doesn't reveal everything is good, you need to take a look at how to mitigate the risk behavior long before you get to the reporting stage to minimize the impact that you're going to have overall. So early and often, and using the rising trend or directional data to point you in the direction of where you need to monitor, and when you do monitor, what your findings are to change behavior and how to get that information back out early enough to address it.
Yeah, so you need a system where you can collect the data and look at it whenever you need it. Yeah.
Just a comment and then a question. So we have found that in the last 2 years, the fact that we've had to collect this data much more robustly has been great, because we've now had much better information to use as part of our monitoring. Thank you. That we've actually had the business involved in looking at that as well, so we can see what the spend is that we're having on individuals and are there differences across therapy areas, etc.
Yes. Yeah.
What I was interested in understanding is, in terms of benchmarking, given that the way different companies, their methodological notes, they all collect things slightly differently, or the way that they report, or the way they collect consent may all be different, you're not sure that you're actually comparing apples with apples. So how much solace can we take if we do some benchmarking that we're not outliers? How can we be sure that what we're looking at is actually a real comparison?
I think obviously it depends on the consent rates to start with. If you're in a country where you have 20%, then it's a very limited set of data that you would do if you want to compare yourself to other companies. Once you get to the higher numbers, I think it is fair to assume that you have a range of numbers in there, and you can see that also when you're looking at the numbers. You see some outliers. So it's not just all the small values that are being reported. But I think it's important to actually drill down and have a look at the details of the data. So it's difficult to generalize, but I think that's exactly why you need a tool to allow you to actually look at individual transactions as well, and then compare. And I think something that we discussed yesterday, which I thought was important as well, benchmarking, obviously in terms of benchmarking to other companies, is useful, but it should trigger a discussion of are the values that we're spending in terms of fair market value okay? Because just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean that we should be doing it as well. So I think, from my point of view, using the data to trigger internal discussions as well is important.
And that's exactly what it has done.
Yeah.
Definitely looking at it on a monthly basis, just to see are we getting up to a certain level and what are the differences between therapy areas.
Yeah. Maybe if you go back to the topic of competitive analysis, because that was discussed quite controversial this morning. If you want to give some comments on who's actually considering competitive analysis and external monitoring. Because the companies that we've spoken to, most companies have done some, but mostly, Excel-based.
Yeah, we have similar analysis, but we use basically for internal analysis. The reason why we don't use for competitive analysis is it's because it depends on the product, it depends on the strategy. So it doesn't mean that we have similar products that we have to have the same strategy. So every time we try to discuss that with the business, doesn't make much sense for them because they try to be innovative, so they don't want to see what the competitors are doing usually, at least. It's our experience internally.
And in terms of doing analytics for the same company across the EFPIA region, have you found that the different regulatory environments are hindering, that are making it very complicated? Or is it something that every country just does for themselves?
If I can just say that I think we've, to Micah's point, because you have such variation across the countries, we've tried not to say, in Germany it was this much and in Sweden it was that much, because you're not necessarily, you can't really draw any conclusions from that. But I think we're all working towards trying to raise consent rates as much as we can. I mean, and certainly some of the feedback that we've had from our German colleagues, for instance, is that this year, because those clinicians that had consented, so this is slightly different to what we've heard from the panel earlier, because they were the ones that had done the right thing, but then they got a lot of negative press. They're thinking, well, next year I don't want to have that negative press, so I may choose to not consent. So it's what we can do to try and mitigate that, because I think that's exactly what we wouldn't want.
So are you setting up programs internally as well to?
So certainly the German affiliates are doing what they can to advance the cause, but I think it needs to be more than just one company, because I think it's got to be across companies that they drive that. And even in the UK, where we've had relatively high consent rates, and interestingly, if you look at the data, the people that didn't give consent are those people that actually have the highest receipt of spend. So it's trying to drive those people that receive the most to disclose, and I think a lot of them thought for the first year that they would keep their heads below the parapet to see what happens, and then next year they may choose to consent. But we do know that some additional analyses are underway at the moment by some people that are relatively hostile to the industry, and I don't think they've done their full analysis yet. So until that gets published, yeah, that may impact on consent rates next year.
Yeah.
But I know, certainly to Marie Claire's point, and certainly the EFPIA, they're all hoping that we will have an increase in our consent rate next year.
I think the experience from the press, from what we heard, is that it was more subdued in general. So I mean, maybe they haven't done the full analysis yet. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we know that they're still doing it.
Yeah.
And they are well known in the medical press for being for not recognising the benefit of the collaboration between industry and other professionals.
I think taking the US as an example, where obviously things are a couple of years ahead, and I know that you can't quite compare with the consent rates, etc. But generally speaking, I think there's a fair amount of attention in the first year in the press, but then it quite quickly calmed down, and it's becoming just more normal that these engagements are being made public, that it's transparency, that's the goal. So I'm hoping it's moving in the same direction in Europe as well. Do you have any further questions in general on what can potentially be done with analytics?
One thing that we haven't talked about at all is, from a compliance perspective, is there a difference in the analytics?
Is there a difference in the analytics that you may look at if you come into a legal issue in the US, maybe a CIA? Additionally, are you using it to provide information for strategic decision-making for the next year, and not so much about what you should be doing or where you could be spending more, but maybe where you should rein it back, and then also directing your policies, future policies. So, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. And obviously, once you know the data, it's much easier to then use it into that strategic direction, and that should be the aim. Again, I think it's about asking the right questions.
In your experience, how much the competitive analytics are used in US?
I will pass that to my colleague next to you, responsible for the US.
So the question is, how much competitive analytics are being used? There are two categories of those being used. One is purely in the compliance space. And in that space, the analytics are being used quite heavily. Excuse me. And the other part is analytics in the commercial space. And those are somewhat limited in their usage. There are two reasons for that limitation. One is there has been a reservation in using spend data in the commercial side. Part of that was concerns if that was acceptable or not. I think most of the industries passed that point, and it went past that point when the regulators started using the spend data and started comparing it to the prescription data. So as soon as the regulators took that position, the industry very quickly was comfortable in doing that type of analysis. And so now I would say that it is a heavy push by the commercial organizations as well as compliance organizations to do those advanced analytics in comparing spend and prescription.
So just to add to that, in Europe we don't have that because the regulatory has not used for that purpose. And we have anti-competition law in place. So, and we are basically as a sector providing data there to look at ourselves. Do you think that can link to some anti-competition reservation from this practice? In Europe, like
So you're with it.
You mean if doing competitive analysis?
Yeah, on the published data that we have available now, are we in breach of anti-competition law in some way?
I think it depends what's the purpose behind the analysis that you're doing.
I'm just talking about the commercial one. So looking to the data available from other companies. With
Yeah.
all the limitations that we have.
questions.
looking just to the data that are available now with all the limitations that they may have, not focusing on using the data and the analytics for compliance purpose, but for commercial purpose, for the business purpose. Do you think that, first of all, I'm not asking if it is ethical or not, I'm just asking, do you think it's in line with an anti-competition law, or there are any concern about that?
I have to say I'm not an expert on the anti-competition laws. From a compliance point of view, I think doing benchmark is important to moving the whole field forward, right, and to getting the most out of this transparency initiative that the pharmaceutical companies have decided to do. From a commercial point of view, I do think even for benchmarking in terms of making strategic decisions for yourself, it is very useful. And from my understanding from the laws, that would not go against the laws.
I'm going to just add one point to it. That might be telling that for comparative analysis, there could be two domains. One is basically commercial, and the other side is compliance oriented. So in compliance space, the comparative analysis would be more around checking the industrial bell curve. Where do you lie with respect to different kind of payments? So if so it's a totally different sort of analysis, which is not the kind which is more into analyzing the market competition that comes into the commercialization space. So there's an element of segmentation between the kind of analysis we do. So the second part, which goes to a commercial space, might have questions around it, but I believe in the compliance space, that segment can be somehow separated from the one. It's an addition to the one.
I'm going to jump topics a little bit. Yesterday, McLean made a comment about who else is looking at the data and what are they going to see in terms of a trend of finding influence. And not to contradict what you said, but the indication that even as little as a simple spend against a physician could influence their behavior. I object to the correlation directly because one thing may have been happening anyway, and there's no way to disprove that easily. But understanding jumps in the trend, you referenced outliers, and outliers are huge because they point to either areas where you may have an issue, but they also may point to opportunities to do something better, right?
Yeah.
And so when we look at this data and truly understanding the data from an analytics and the validity of correlating pieces of data is something that companies who are the stewards of the data really need to impart that where an inference can really be made and what the validity of that data is. Because otherwise those fascinomas can send limited resources off in directions that aren't necessarily an issue. So that piece of things is a burden. Every time we open up and look at data, we then have responsibility to react. You can no longer say, I didn't know. If you looked at the data, you might not understand what it's telling you, but once you've opened it up and you've looked, if someone else is looking, then you no longer have the opportunity to say, I didn't know. So yeah. I think there's something here that is, because it's burgeoning, because the data set, especially in Europe, is so limited because of elements of consent, the broad regulations across countries, that it's it's kind of a little bit dangerous all the way around as we begin to understand what's available in the data. So knowing what your company's practice is as at the root of it is going to be, regardless of what the data reveal, is going to be a necessary piece of part of things, finding out the worst thing.
Yeah, I think it was quite an interesting point that was made earlier that Spiegel went through this effort putting all the data together. And when you ask the companies, they themselves hadn't actually looked at it. And that can be dangerous.
So I'd like to comment on your, the competitive analysis. So the Department of Justice panel just about a month ago stated that manufacturers should be looking at their data, and they gave an example. They said, we're mining the data, and we noticed a change from 2014 to 2015, that overall there was a shift from royalty payments to charitable contribution payments. Okay? So how many of you are looking at your data, even on an Excel spreadsheet, to see if your business has now learned about open payments and is now shifting payments because physicians are becoming more aware? And physicians are saying, nope, I don't want the royalty, pay it to my charity. So you should be looking at that because the government's looking at that. Now, from a benchmarking perspective, you guys should download that data or look at the open payments data and see if your competitors are actually shifting. Because salespeople are smart. They're going to find out from the physicians and the hospitals that they're working with, and whether they like it or not, they're going to be told by the customer, I don't want to receive royalty anymore. I want to receive a charitable contribution to my charity. And again, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's just part of business. And these are how the regulations are now affecting the way your salespeople and the way your businesses are doing business. And you should be aware of that. You don't want someone else coming to knock on your door telling you, this is, to your point, you gotta look at your data. You really look at the data.
To your comment, I was sharing with some other colleagues here during the break. We are looking at the data even cross borders because we could notice a trend of physicians coming out from Europe to go to emerging markets. The reason is because not everybody knows the rules, so not everybody asks for consent. So we put a project together, of course, to mitigate that, but this can happen. So that's what she just said. I mean, it's something new in Europe. They will try to do something else somewhere else just to get what they want. They are not doing anything wrong, but we need to have proper procedures and rules in place to cover that.
Yeah.
I could pick up on the data analysis.
So what that means, the Department of Justice basically said, look, we're looking for outliers. And somebody raised their hand and then said, well, what have you seen? And that's where the answer came, oh, we've seen a movement from royalty to charitable contributions. And guess what? We're going to go knock on the doors of those companies that have the shift, and we're going to inquire. We're going to ask why. The camel's nose under the tent, you don't want that. You really don't want somebody to knock on your door and invite you into their office and say, we just want to have a few questions with you. And then start asking you those questions, because then you're opening yourself up to, millions of dollars of investigation fees just to, try to answer those questions. So that's the tip for the day, the savings.
And just to support what Micheline just shared, there is a collective change in the spend behavior that's being observed in the US industry. For example, today, as they are evaluating their 2016 data, if a company is seeing gifts in their spend, that has almost become a norm. So there is an immediate sort of review and investigation where that is coming from. And as you look at their spend patterns from 13 through 16, you would see a drastic elimination of gifts as a spend category. So it is a reflection of a change and an adjustment that each manufacturer is making, but that's only happening once they have visibility into the collective pattern. without that visibility, it would be difficult for them to really be in the common middle ground. So that's just another element to that behavioral change as you look at analytics collectively.
I've just got the sign for 5 minutes. I actually think that's very deliberate of the time. That's fantastic. Are there any further questions?
So not a question, but it's interesting that we were talking about the external analysis that can be done on the data. But one aspect that I thought was more important that you discussed earlier would be from the internal monitoring point of view. So in Spanish, for example, there's a saying that ojos que no veo, los corazón lo siento. That means if eyes don't see, that heart doesn't feel it. So as a bad example, if someone's girlfriend is cheating and he doesn't know it, doesn't feel it, but once you see it and you know it, then it starts hurting. And there are a lot of things that might miss out. For example, if I'm writing a letter, I will definitely give someone else to review it. So in that sense, that review of data from the internal monitoring point of view is one core aspect that I think most of the companies have been looking at. A recent example that I just saw in one of the data is one company who is calculating the percentage of consented ICPs is using a different sort of denominator, while the other company is using a different denominator. Based on their using these, one company was using probably a superset of the number of ICPs, the other company was using based on the type of spend that they have done. So all those things won't be visible until unless you might see some outliers, and then you want to verify those hypotheses going down to the detailed level analysis. So this data might somehow point you to these hypotheses, and then the internal drill that you have to has to be done. So it's not be more like a decision support system. It's more like sparking conversation around what we have done and what can we do better. Thanks.
I think we should wrap it up here then. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the questions.